Get your ears wrapped around the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast. All the scoop you need to know from college basketball to the NBA and even March Madness. News of your rising stars. Topics on and off the hardwood. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast.
Welcome into the GSMC Basketball Podcast, right here in the GSMC Podcast Network. It is your host, Brice Lewis, back at it again to talk about everything happening in the world of basketball. And we got big news coming out of the NBA, as we have an exclusive story that dropped from ESPN about the perks that James Harden got and the power he had in that organization. I'll give you my thoughts on it on today's show. We're also going to talk about Giannis. Giannis finally answers the question if he's going to sign long-term with the Bucks today. I'm going to discuss his decision and how it affects the NBA moving forward. We're also going to talk about some NBA news. The Lakers and LeBron James and Anthony Davis finally playing in the preseason, talking about how they looked, and maybe previewing slightly our Tuesday matchup when they open up the season against the Clippers, plus other NBA news on today's show. Guys, don't forget, before I get into it, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at GSMC_basketball. That's GSMC_basketball. You can keep update with us there about everything happening in the world of basketball, as we all love this great game that is the NBA and college basketball. So, you know what we got to start with. It's been leading almost half my shows because there's always something new coming out. James Harden. Last time, I was talking about how his stance remained unchanged after coming to camp, after practicing with the team, how he has no interest in playing with John Wall. Now we have an exclusive story from ESPN. It always feels like these stories always come out when some stuff like this happens, when there's a player that's disgruntled, when there's issues with an organization. But the thing is that one thing about reporting, I'm going to give y'all an inside tip into what happens with reporting in these types of stories. A lot of the time, a lot of the people who break these stories already knew these things were happening. They were getting told throughout the year. That's why it's so important to have connections in reporting and doing these types of things, to get connections, to get inside information. So they knew this was going on, but the thing about stuff like this is you can't just randomly release it. There has to be something that makes you release it. The Houston can't be in the middle of a 20-game winning streak and then you release that James Harden has all these perks. Because then what's the point of the story? Really, what's the point of the story? Like, okay, they're on a 20-game winning streak. Like, it doesn't hit the same. It doesn't make sense to break it. They always break it at inopportune times. And in a situation where now you hear he wants out, there's issues with the organization, there's a lot of stuff going on. What led to this decision? Players wanting to leave Harden. This was the perfect time for now to put all of it together and then say, okay, over my time, this is what I've learned. And basically, this story from ESPN, I believe it was Tim McManus, basically said James Harden had literal control of the organization. He was the main guy who controlled everything. He controlled when flights were to leave. He controlled practices. He controlled, he missed meetings. He basically there was an exclusive. There was something within the article where basically they were like, when Russell Westbrook was there, this past year, they were in film study. And Russ was just like, and Harden was late, and Russ was just like, okay, let's go ahead and start it without him. And then basically, D'Antoni said, well, we're going to have to restart when he comes, so we might as well wait. And basically, it added to the reason why Russell, Chris Paul, and Dwight Howard all wanted out of Houston because of these perks that Dwight Howard had. I mean, not Dwight, but James Harden had. Because here's the thing, every superstar has perks. So it's not the perks that's the issue. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with him. If he wants to go on a private jet to a party afterwards, or he wants to do something like that, that's his personal decision. But I think you would have issues where players would have problems is holding up film study. Like, remember, these guys, like, listen, you're trying to get into the film room, you're trying to learn, you're trying to work with the team, you're trying to build that chemistry, and you got this one guy who's waiting everybody up, like, we out here, we're on time, and then we don't know how long it's going to take James to get there. Or when you're trying to get ready to go to the next game, remember, the NBA season is a long season. You know what I'm saying? Like, you really, I'm sure players, when they go from game to game, they're trying to get from point A to point B. They hope there's no delays. They can rest. They can do what they got to do. And the fact that James was literally holding up flights. Like, imagine if you're trying to get to the next city, get to the hotel so y'all can get settled in, and y'all got to wait because a player doesn't want to show up. And the team has to wait for him to get there. Because if it wasn't James Harden, they'd probably leave him. That's why you don't really hear a lot of other players that are not big names doing that. But you'll hear somebody like James do that. Remember, we heard the similar in LA with the Clippers where they said, remember, Kawhi would come all the way from San Diego because they allowed him to live in San Diego, which was actually a longer ride. So when they would leave for games, Kawhi was coming from a longer distance, sitting in traffic. They would have late flights. And so, but where this one, the only difference was, okay, Kawhi lived far. It sounds like with James basically sat here and was just like, well, I'm going to get there when I want to. And that's a big issue. And I could see where players would have an issue with that. Like, really, I could see that. I understand why players would sit here and say, this isn't cool. This isn't what we want. And so I think for the most part of the situation, first question would be, the Houston made a mistake giving him that much power to that extent. Like, listen, if you want to give James perks because if he's a superstar, that's fine. But I think the amount of perks and then seeing how it affected things. Because basically, you got to think about it. James had control of everything. When he wanted Dwight, Chris Paul out, he said, get him out and get me somebody else. Houston would do it with no issue. And the point is now, Houston has done so much. They've given away so many assets, first round picks, everything for James Harden. And now James is sitting here saying, well, I don't think this is a championship team anymore. I want to leave. It's almost like, are you serious? The reason why the team is the way it is to this day is because of you. It's because you wanted this, James. And so now you're trying to sit here and say, we can't satisfy you anymore. Even though you're the reason why the team is constructed the way it is. Why we don't have many trade assets. Why we don't have many draft picks. It's honestly a crazy thing to think that James would sit here and do that. But James is. And I think that's unfair to everybody who's played in Houston because during James Harden's tenure, because they're just out here trying to do their job. They're out here not complaining. They're out here trying to do what they got to do. And basically, you got James over here saying, well, I don't want to play with you guys anymore. I don't feel like y'all give me the best chance to win anymore. And I think that's messed up. Because you got guys, like, listen, I think James Harden has pride. I don't think he's going to miss games. I think James Harden's still going to try to be James Harden. Because I mentioned in my last show, knowing where he stands with the team, would that affect how he plays? And where I would think it would affect things is, remember, James Harden last year, one thing that stood out to everybody about his game on the defensive side was he would make a lot of hustle plays. He would make a lot of plays that involve you really just wanting it. Now those plays may not come this year. You may see the James Harden of 3 years ago where he would play a lot of Olay defense. You can go right past him, or he ain't going to fight for that loose ball. Because for him, he has no intentions of being here long term. So I say James can still do his offensive thing. He can do dribble, three. He can still do all that. That's not going to change with James. It's the extra plays outside of the skill set. The hustle plays is where I think you're not going to get James's effort. And so that's kind of where the big issue is going to be at with the situation. Because if James is going to sit here and not give you hustle plays, you got to think about, how do other teammates on the team feel? How does John Wall feel? Christian Wood, DeMarcus Cousins, Eric Gordon, how do they feel? Because they're going to be observing it just like everybody else. And if they feel like James is giving his best foot forward, How is that going to affect them? Because they're trying to help Steven Salas in this new regime get off to a good start. They're trying to have a productive culture. Because remember, Houston's not a culture that is a losing tradition. They've never won. It's not like a culture that's just been bad. It's not that kind of culture. Houston has always pretty much had a good culture most of their career. Most of their franchise's history. They've had a pretty good culture. And it just feels like James is kind of sitting there and kind of being like, y'all need me. I'm the best player y'all ever had. Which some people would still argue, even though James Harden is an all-time great player, won't even go down as the best player to ever play in a Houston uniform. I think a lot of people would still sit here and say maybe Hakeem Olajuwon. So, to me, listen, we saw the game with James. He looked a little out of shape. People were wondering, what has he been doing? And I already told you guys, too, that him partying, posting about it while this is going on has really hurt his image. It's rubbing people the wrong way because it's just like, you're doing all that. Then you come to the games a little out of shape. And it's just kind of like, dang, James. Like, really, it's like, dang. It almost feels like you're disrespecting the organization. You're disrespecting the culture. You're disrespecting Houston. Because you're basically like, well, y'all can't do what I need you to do for me anymore. So basically, I don't feel like I need to do what I need to do anymore. And so I'm going to start doing what I want to do. And sometimes these types of situations have enabled a person where maybe James always had the personality where he was kind of a selfish person. I mean, people have said James gives off a vibe of kind of a selfish guy. And with Houston giving him that kind of power, further, fed into his ego, further fed into, that side of him where now it's like, that's him. He feels like, listen, if I'm not getting what I want, I'm James Harden. I'm not going to settle for this. I'm going to do what I want to do. And all y'all can do is just suck it up and deal with it. And that's why, I feel like in these situations when you got teams trading for a guy like this, they always feel like, well, he's unhappy in Houston. He's like this in Houston. He's not going to be like that here. Because you really do have to have a strong culture to take James Harden, I think. Because he may come there and think, I'm James Harden. Houston can't do what I need anymore. All right, what are y'all going to do for me? And they're like, well, James, we're obviously going to let you have some perks. We're going to try to put the best team around you to win. But here's the thing. These are our rules for you being here so we don't feel like we're getting outside of who we are as a franchise. That's why going to a team like Miami would be interesting because Pat Riley doesn't really allow stuff. Remember, Pat Riley said no to LeBron. And LeBron is considered the face of the league. So James Harden can't expect to have the same power he had in Houston and Miami. And a lot of other teams. Now, obviously, a team that is trying to be up and coming or a team that doesn't have that type of history may be willing to sit here and do that. But teams that have an established culture like Miami and San Antonio, they may sit there and say, yeah, we go do our best for you, but we're not going to also let you walk all over us either. And so I think that's going to be the biggest thing moving forward. And we're going to have to see how this works out because trade rumors are starting to heat up. A lot more teams are starting to engage the Houston Rockets. So we're going to go ahead and take a break here. Coming up next, I'm going to get more into teams trying to make an aggressive move towards James Harden. We're going to discuss that here on the podcast up next.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we discussed the James Harden situation, the power that he had in the Houston organization, and how I believe it's been one of the things that I think is really a crying shame. I think that James has been the reason why Houston is where they are now, and I feel like that's why it kind of looks somewhat, if you want to say, hypocritical for him to want out of a situation that he basically created. Because he was the one who dictated how everything went, who was there, etc., etc. So, to me, it just makes me feel like, you know, if James wants to leave, I get it. I think maybe with this new regime, a new coach, new GM, it may be the best time for them to restart and try to establish their culture there, find themselves their next star that they want to build around and go from there. So, because, you know, Houston, like I said, has a history of being a good organization. They've never been known as a bad organization or an organization that has struggled to be winners. So I believe they have the pedigree to bounce back. But I was going to talk about the Harden trade rumors, but I'm going to talk about something else actually. Something that actually just recently came up. And it's about the NBA investigating the Los Angeles Clippers and Jerry West, accordingly to the recruitment of Kawhi Leonard, as there is a lawsuit that has been filed against Jerry West and the Clippers. And now the NBA is thinking there's enough here to investigate it. Now, if you remember about a year ago, when the recruitment started with Kawhi Leonard, from different people within the media were talking about how Uncle Dennis, who basically is the guy who represents Kawhi, he basically was asking, even though we basically never got a true confirmation if this was the exact thing, even though people have said it, was asking for things that were illegal within the collective bargaining agreement. And so basically, Uncle Dennis was asking for part ownerships, private jets, certain money, certain average sponsor money, everything of that sort. And, teams couldn't give that to him. If you think about it, the Philadelphia 76ers reported that when they were recruiting Kawhi, these things were basically, there were things asked for that were not appropriate within the collective bargaining agreement. Don't forget, when Masai Ujiri was asked about what he wanted while he was in Toronto, he was just like, I'm not comfortable speaking about that. So clearly, I'm a person who feels like clearly stuff was asked for that teams knew if we do this, we could get in trouble. And so for me, that was a very interesting, tidbit that now we have a lawsuit being filed here, and basically they're saying, hey, they kind of were asking for things they shouldn't have asked for. And, well, really this lawsuit was asking is basically, because the guy who filed this lawsuit was actually is basically the agent's agent. He's basically the guy who also worked with Uncle Dennis. He worked with Uncle Dennis. And so he was apparently promised money. Johnny Wilkes is his name. Was basically feels like he said he was alleged he was supposed to be paid $2.5 million for helping basically push Kawhi Leonard towards the franchise. This is a quote about some of the things that Wilkes is basically, saying in this lawsuit, and I quote, Wilkes says in the lawsuit he immediately went to work and began convincing Kawhi and Kawhi's uncle the Clippers were the right team for him after he just left the Toronto Raptors. Wilkes said he told West and the Clippers that that they needed to get Paul George first and foremost to hook Kawhi. Then he says he helped connect West with Kawhi's uncle. Wilkes also claims in the suit he gave West a specific game plan for how the Clippers should pitch Kawhi during an important meeting with West, Leonard, Doc Rivers, and others in July 2019. West issued a statement to TMZ, and this is what he said, and I quote, I am not aware of any lawsuit being filed against me, and I deny engaging in any improper conduct in the connection with Kawhi Leonard. The Clippers also released a statement and said, the lawsuit filed by Johnny Wilkes is replete with inaccuracies and allegations are baseless. The Clippers are fully cooperating with the NBA's investigation, which is standard when these types of allegations are made. They are providing the NBA with evidence that the allegations are false. And like I said, this has been something that's actually been talked about, discussed for a while. People have said, there was some things asked for in other recruitments. And so this kind of brings up a topic to me, that I think we need to discuss here. I understand, superstars get perks. They get things that regular players don't get. That's not the issue. But remember something, with LeBron James, he basically brought player empowerment. Because LeBron was the first guy, really, that we were really saying he controlled Cleveland when he was in Cleveland. Like, basically, they did what LeBron wanted. And that's why his relationship with Dan Gilbert, obviously leaving Cleveland and then coming back, and his relationship with him was never great. But basically, saying, LeBron was the first guy to really basically dictate how a franchise ran. And then, he increased player empowerment. Then the fact that he now says, well, if you don't give me what I want, I'll leave. And now he increased player movement and mobility. And, now we have all these superstars getting perks, which has always been the case. Superstars have always gotten perks. But my question that I want to ask here is, are we getting to a point where too many, or the superstars that are superstars, are they taking too much advantage of having the power that they have within these organizations? We just came off talking about Harden, and then we're talking about Kawhi. Remember, Kawhi, we talked about the perks he got and how that rubbed teammates the wrong way, how it kind of created some dysfunction within the locker room. Then we got the James thing. And it kind of makes you sit here and wonder, are there any other superstar players who are maybe doing this within their organizations? Because to me, it could open up the possibility for the NBA to come back and say, okay, listen, we're having too many incidents where superstars are basically getting these perks that are outside the normal perk. Because if it's okay, they can decide, okay, when and when off, not to cancel practice. Because listen, you would think a leader in that situation, if you're your superstar player, would be smart. Okay, let's say we have a back-to-back, then we have a day off, then we know they have another game. Maybe you have practice scheduled on that day between the back-to-back and that one game, and you may sit here and say, okay, let's go ahead and just, let's not, practice, let's rest our bodies. You expect your leader to be responsible there, and everything like that. Or, hey, listen, if he wants a private jet, that's fine. I don't think everybody's going to be pissed off because the best player on our team got a private jet somewhere. You know what I'm saying? Because remember, everybody making millions on that team. You could easily still go do something too. It's not like you can't do anything, and he can. He just is maybe the team's just helping supply it. But basically, for what I'm saying is like, the normal perks. You know what I'm saying? Now, when you start getting into making the team late on purpose, like James, or you're starting to get into, or like Kawhi, since the Clippers allowed him to live in San Diego, or, I can decide when I play and when I don't play. Because that's a perk that could easily rub somebody the wrong way. Because think about it. We could be down 5 minutes in 10 minutes, like with 10 minutes left in the fourth quarter, down like 6. Now, let's say the team has some momentum. And let's say this is without your best player on the floor. And then let's say your best player is like, I don't want to go back in yet. But let's say maybe one of the players on the floor are winded, or maybe the other team's best players come back in the game, and then he's just like, I'm going to stay on the bench a little longer. And then let's say now you lose the lead. And you're just like, well, why didn't you come off the bench? And it's just like, well, I didn't want to. You know what I'm saying? Like, I know it's like not the best example, but it's just an example of what I'm trying to explain is basically those types of powers can sometimes rub someone the wrong way. Because usually with star players, they want to play most minutes. They want to play a lot. They want to, because they have a legacy they're trying to uphold. They're trying to get numbers, stats. They're trying to be great. You never hear a lot of star players sitting here thinking, I'm going to intentionally take a lot of time out of these games. Or, he'll feel like, we're playing against a bad team. I'll probably play 25 minutes tonight. You know what I'm saying? Like, those are the situations that sometimes are different. And so, I think, with everything that's happening, like I said, right now within the NBA, I think we have to ask that question, are superstars getting too much power? And will the league have to step in and say, okay, we're going to limit the power you have? Like, yes, we're not going to limit any perk you have. But we're not going to sit here and tell you you're not getting anything. Or you're not going to be able to do anything you want. Because it easily can hurt a team's chemistry. We just seen in Houston. Listen, we have not heard that players in Houston have been rubbed the wrong way by how James Harden's been running the organization. We haven't heard it. But to think that no player, but basically knowing that Russell wanted to leave, knowing that Chris Paul wanted to leave, knowing that Dwight Howard wanted to leave, there's your evidence that they really, it's the players who were close to James's level were the ones who had an issue with it. Because they were willing, because we know Russell and Chris are some of the hardest workers in the NBA. They're going to grind with everybody else to make sure the team is at best as good as they can be. And then you have James Harden who's basically sitting here saying, well, I don't feel the same way. I don't feel like I need to be on time all the time. I don't feel like I need to do this all the time. You know what I'm saying? Y'all can do it when I'm ready. And I can understand why that rubs a guy like Chris Paul and James Harden. Remember, the closest James ever got to a championship is with Chris Paul. They were a really good team with Chris Paul. But for some reason, he wanted Chris out of there. You know what I'm saying? And so, to me, that's where I think the issue kind of comes with James. And then Kawhi, we clearly heard about Lou, Patrick Beverley, and Montrezl Harrell, who left, who had an issue with the perks that Kawhi and Paul George were getting. So clearly you could see if you are giving your superstar this type of power and it's not for the betterment. See, it's one thing if he grinded with the team and stuff like that, and then he did things like this from time to time. Because they know, well, he does his thing, but we know when we need him, he going to be there. With James, it's like as a teammate, it's just like you're basically dictating how hard we work or something. Like we're out here grinding it, and you can kind of take and lily daggle around, and then that's why it doesn't help that James came in to the preseason. It looks like he was out of shape. Kind of saw the gut. James Harden seems like a person who, if he is not constantly on his eating well and all that stuff, he can gain weight kind of easily. And listen, the thing about James is the craziest thing is he's been working hard. He got himself into shape for the bubble. He's been working on his game defensively. So I think maybe that's why players didn't sometimes go out of their way to say something negative. But then you come back, say you don't want to be here, you're out of shape, then that could rub people the wrong way. You're rubbing superstars the wrong way. Same thing with Kawhi Leonard. You're rubbing teammates the wrong way. Even though a lot of people more understand why Kawhi got those perks more than Paul George, but we already discussed that. So maybe that's just something we have to think about. Are players getting too much power in these situations, and could that create more divisions in locker rooms if that happens? So it's just something we got to keep an eye on. But that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, I'm going to get into the James Harden trade rumors, plus other news around NBA circles. Stay tuned right here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we discussed the NBA's investigation against the Clippers and just how it may be possible that we are giving too much power to the star player, the superstar player, based off the situations we have heard recently with Kawhi Leonard in LA and James Harden in Houston. So clearly that is a discussion that may start to pop up in circles, especially with the empowerment of players in the NBA, where players can kind of run the NBA to a certain extent. So that is something that we definitely have to keep an eye on moving forward into it. Before we get into what I'm about to talk about next, please, again, don't forget to follow us at GSMC_basketball on Twitter. Follow us there for all the latest updates and news on basketball around the association, college, and professional. Now, again, I said I was going to get to some James Harden trade rumors, but I'm going to push that back again, another segment. You know what I'm saying? Because, sometimes I'm feeling it in between breaks. I'm just like, you know what, let me go with this. So this is what we're going to go with now. We're going to talk about Giannis. Because this is some pretty big news, clearly, because of how it impacts the NBA. Because Giannis has now signed his 5-year Supermax extension with the Milwaukee Bucks. He has committed to them long term, and now every team that was maybe hoping Giannis might become a free agent or become available by trade now will have to change their plans. So speaking about what this means for Milwaukee, Milwaukee has their guy. Giannis says, I'll give you guys 5 more years to prove to me that we could be a championship team. He has a 5th-year option, I believe, or was it a 4th-year option? I think it was a 4th-year option. But basically, he basically has the ability to opt out after a certain amount of time. And so the impact for Milwaukee is now they have their guy. They have their cornerstone. They have the guy who will keep that Milwaukee market thriving. They have that person who really... I've always said this since the beginning of this process with Giannis. From hearing him in interviews, from hearing him talk, from hearing the things he says, he is someone who I always said he wants to stay in Milwaukee. You could just, I feel like I could feel it. He wants to stay so bad. It was just one of those things where you have to give me a team or a reason to stay. Because based off our playoff success, the current team isn't good enough. It was almost just like, if they lost him, it would be because they forced him to leave, not because he wanted to leave. Because he just needed to know that y'all were going to make things happen and put certain things in place to help them be in position to potentially compete for a championship in the Eastern Conference. They added Drew Holiday. You still got Chris Middleton, DiVincenzo, those guys. They have guys, and I think Brook Lopez as well. And so you have guys on this team who can ball. And Giannis, we know Giannis has to work on his free throws. We know Giannis has to work on his jump shot. He still has to involve his game. Because, when it gets into the playoffs, it seems like everybody's able to kind of play a certain way against him. And that's why he doesn't have the same playoff success that he's had. Or he's had the playoff success that he's had. And why it's so different from the regular season. And so, Giannis, winning 2 MVPs, I'm sure he sits there and thinks to himself, I got my MVPs, I've done a lot of individual things, but now I want to reach that ultimate team success. And he really wants to reach that team success with the Milwaukee Bucks. He wants to do it in Milwaukee. That's the team that he feels like is the team that he wants to say, let me bring a championship here. And let's be honest, Milwaukee's never always been a bad franchise. They've had some great players play there. In Milwaukee. They've won some things before. Obviously, back in the middle of the 1900s, not middle of the 1900s, in the middle of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, but they've had success. It's just, we know, especially today's NBA, with them being a small market team, it's very difficult for them to acquire a superstar player through agency because Milwaukee is not a destination. I've always said the NBA is the sport that players, since they have so much empowerment, literally looks at a city and says, I don't want to play here because of that. Don't matter how well your organization is, unless you get traded there. If they had their personal decision, a lot of players will not choose to go there because of the city. Where you see in the NFL, you notice they always try to have a lot of their teams in cities that people want to play in. Like, think about it, they have 2 Los Angeles teams. Who wouldn't want to play in Los Angeles? You got San Francisco. That's not a bad place. You got Miami. That's not a bad place. Atlanta. That's not a bad place. Dallas. Houston. Outside of maybe if you want to talk about Kansas City or whatever, they have pretty big, teams in certain areas. It's like, okay. Plus, it's an NFL team, and I don't think I think NFL players don't look at the city and say, I can't play here because of this. Because I think NFL players, knowing how the NFL is, knowing how careers can be ended, that's why they always look for money. They're not looking at, they could live in the worst city in the NFL and say, well, they're paying me the most or whatever. Where NBA, that's not the case. Players really do care about where they play and the city they're in. So it's going to be hard for Milwaukee to acquire top-level players. They can still acquire the all-star or a really good player. Because there are players in that way where they're just like, I'll still play here because it is. But like a superstar guy, you'll never really hear of a guy saying, unless a guy, like I said, it was different for LeBron in Cleveland. Because he was born in Ohio. He was raised in Ohio, was drafted to his hometown team. So it makes sense why he sat there and said, okay, I'm willing to stick here in Cleveland and win. You kind of have to have that connection to a small town or to a small city to really, to really want to win for a small city. Like, think about it. Think about Kawhi, Paul George, Chris Paul. A lot of these guys played in major or not even major cities sometimes, just they played in states that, like California. That's a big-time state. There's not a lot of places in California you feel like are just like, small town. Usually every place is a really relatively decent quality place, and you want to play for the main California areas or the main California teams. That's why you always see them wanting to go back to big cities or go to other big cities. Where think about Giannis. He came from Greece. He probably wasn't, I don't know what life is like in Greece, but he was probably never told or taught or raised to be like, oh, the biggest city in Greece is where you want to go. And I think that's why when he came to America, he never really was the type of guy who was like California, Miami appeals to him because he's just like, what does it do for me? I came from a place where that didn't matter. I just wanted to play basketball and be the best to ever play this game. I don't care where I do it at. I just want to be the best. You know what I'm saying? So he never sat here and was, so just mind blown by, oh, wow, Atlanta. Oh, wow, Miami. Oh, wow, LA. He was never one of those guys. He was a guy who just worked his way from another country here. Because remember, a lot of overseas players from Greece don't make it here and actually have substantial careers. So he wanted to just be that guy who could make it from Greece, became a superstar in the NBA, and that's why he's very much comfortable playing for the Milwaukee Bucks and staying in Milwaukee, because for him, it was never a big deal to begin with to play in a big city. And not, like I said, not every player feels that way. There's not a lot of players who have that same aspiration. Usually when you become a star, you want to start playing in star areas. You want to start playing in the cities that have big name, limelights, everything of that sort. That's why people have said for the longest the Knicks were always a team that, they're going to be in the free agent mix because they're a big city. It's New York. Who wouldn't want to play in New York, the limelight, the great skyline, everything of that is New York City. Now, we've seen over the last few years that doesn't work anymore because, they've been so dysfunctional and bad for so long. Players eventually are going to sit here and say, okay, I want to play in a big city, but I don't want to play in a horrible, dysfunctional big city. Because if I do that, I'm committing career suicide just for location. Where at least giving to a big city that actually has, a good direction, leadership, or other stars to play with. And so that's kind of always been the biggest thing right now. And that's why I think Giannis made the best decision for him. Now, how this impacts other teams, I think now a lot of teams, I said this, on Twitter. I said, with Giannis signing the Supermax extension, I expect James Harden rumors to heat up, which they have. Because now teams that were waiting on Giannis to see what was going to happen are like, okay, well, let's try James. Because now you still get a top 5 player. You can still get a top 5 player, and you have to trade for him, though. Giannis, though, people were like, okay, we could trade for him, but we know he also might become a free agent, so we're going to kind of play the waiting game. See, James, he has 2 years with Houston left. So you have to trade for him. So, and now remember, the trade deadline is in March. So you got time, but eventually you never know which team's going to actually go ahead and try to press for James Harden. And so you got to think as a team and as an organization, well, how badly do we want this guy? How important do we think this guy is going to be to what we want to do? And, what are we willing to do to put ourselves in a position to acquire him from said team? So, I think the next big domino is James. I think Giannis has now made teams sit here and say, okay, because think about Miami. They were waiting to see what was going to happen with Giannis. Giannis signed a Supermax. So now they might try to go ahead and make that trade for James because they're like, we need a superstar here if we're going to win a championship. We tried Giannis, he left. James might have to be our best option. But now the biggest thing that you've noticed with a lot of trade packages that I'll discuss more is that certain teams don't want to give up certain players to get James. Even though the Houston Rockets have proclaimed, you got to give us this player because we need this in return if we're going to give you James. And like I said, I think James has the pride. I think he's going to play, games. So more than anything, you just kind of, in this situation, if you're a team trying to go after James Harden, you just hope he doesn't get hurt or anything of that sort, where now it's like, okay, now we're trading for damaged goods. So that would be the main thing. But at this point, you probably feel like, okay, James is here on the table. We have a chance to acquire him, let him be a part of our team. We just got to do what we got to do to make that happen. Because literally, listen, everybody was shocked that LeBron signed an extension. So LeBron's not going to be on the market. Paul George isn't going to be on the market. Giannis isn't going to be on the market. James is going to be. This free agency class that everybody was gearing up for is now dwindled down. The only person that we know is going to be on the market still at this point is Kawhi Leonard, because we believe he'll opt out. And with all the stuff happening in LA right now, we don't know if this situation with the investigation and everything, it will, and depending on how the Clippers season goes, how that's going to affect Kawhi's decision moving on. So that might be the next guy, but we haven't really heard rumors that Kawhi's looking to leave, which is why I think teams haven't necessarily been trying to say, well, let's wait for Kawhi Leonard, especially with everything that's been happening with Uncle Dennis. Because I'm sure they're like, well, if Uncle Dennis is going to be like that, then we may have to maybe avoid Kawhi Leonard in that situation. And so it looks like at this point, the biggest domino and the biggest player left that you can maybe get between now and next year's free agency is James Harden. And so now teams are like, okay, if we want that superstar guy, what are we willing to do to get him? Because Giannis has now re-signed with Milwaukee and he's not on the table no longer. And that's all the time we have here for this segment. Coming up next, we're going to get into James Harden rumors, finally. And then we're also going to get into Los Angeles Lakers talk as LeBron and AD played in the preseason. We're going to talk about that and more up next, right here on the GSMC Basketball Podcast.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Last segment, we discussed Giannis signing his Supermax extension and how it will affect the NBA moving forward, as now everybody turns their attention towards James Harden as the big fish. As I've basically said, the 2021 free agency class that everybody was like, oh, all the big stars are coming out. Everybody's going to be in the free agency class. LeBron James, Paul George, Giannis, da-da-da-da-da. All of them basically came back and re-signed and signed extensions, AD too. So the only person who's going to be in free agency is Kawhi, and we have no indication right now if Kawhi is going to leave, even though we have a lot of stuff going on with Kawhi. So we don't know if that could change, but basically James Harden's the next big fish in the big superstar movement pool. And so we're going to have to see if that happens, which we're going to get into this segment. And we're going to talk about teams that are interested, because the trade rumors for Houston and James Harden have heated up. teams are now becoming aggressive. I said after Giannis signs this Supermax extension, teams are going to start to want to call Houston more. Because before it was like we could wait and see what Giannis do. But now we know what he's doing. So if we still want a superstar, we know who the best next guy to get is. And so there are actually some teams in here outside of the teams that he listed. So the Dallas Mavericks, we've known they have been on a mission to get him a third star. They're in the trade discussions for James Harden. That's an interesting team to me because if you look at their assets, I don't think they can trade for James Harden without giving up one of their 2 stars. And if they gave up one of their 2 stars, it would probably be Kristaps. But then the issue with that be Luka and James kind of play the same way. So would that work? And one thing I've always said about potentially making a trade for James Harden is I feel like a lot of teams would need to insert a third team to get this trade done. To me, I feel like you need that third team. And I think Dallas may be one of those teams where we got to get a third team involved to make it happen. It's the same thing with Brooklyn. Brooklyn's not going to get a trade done because we have been reported that Houston doesn't really like the trade pieces that the Nets can offer them. So they're like, well, we don't really like what you got. So Brooklyn, if they really wanted to acquire a James Harden, if they're not going to give up a Kyrie or KD, they'd have to get a third team involved. And probably a third team, I would try to go after maybe a team that has championship or high-level expectations in the next few years. Because, those teams are willing to give off draft picks. I feel like if you don't have the draft capital, you could afford to get a team of that caliber in there and see if they're willing to give up their draft picks. And then maybe one of you ship a player to him or 2 players to them that they can maybe use for their potential future. And then you can give up maybe that key crucial player to Houston to get James Harden. That's just an idea. So Dallas, Brooklyn, Miami. Now, Miami, we've been hearing that they would like to not trade Tyler Hero, but he's not untouchable. And then they said they really are trying to hang on to Duncan. Because I always said Miami's in a situation. Their core team is what Houston wants in a trade. And yeah, you're going to get back James Harden, but you may only have Jimmy Butler and James Harden. Because what if you do give up Bam? What if you do give up Tyler Hero? What if you do give up Duncan Robinson? Your 3 players are going to be Jimmy Butler, James Harden, Warren Rockers. Those are going to be your 3 best players. But you don't have that interior defender. Remember, outside of Bam, you can make an argument. They don't have that much interior depth. They give up their interior depth. They have no interior. Yeah, you got James Harden averaging 30. And Jimmy Butler can ball. And Grogic can have big nights. But it feels like now the rest of the team, what made the team Miami last year, a finals team, isn't there anymore. And so now you would have to ask yourself, would Miami really be that much more better than last year's team? Star power wise, yes. But overall, would they be? So this would be I could understand why they would if we could just keep a Duncan. Because at least we still got our 3-point shooter. We still got James. We got Dragic. We got Butler. We can and then we can kind of fill out the rest of because sometimes situations like this, people feel like when that trade deadline hits, maybe we could sign a guy, we could get a guy, fill out the rest of this roster, and then still be a competitive team when that time comes. Because Pat Riley knows how to work these types of situations. So that's a potential possibility, where they could potentially go with. With the team. And it's a very interesting perspective to me. Because every team has their unique dilemma when it comes to trying to make a trade for James. Because he is going to be the guy who people are going to go after. And then we could get to Philadelphia. Now, we're hearing 2 different kinds of reports. We're hearing that the Philadelphia 76ers are willing to give up Ben Simmons for James Harden, but they're just not close to a deal. And then Daryl Morey came out and said, we're not trading Ben Simmons. That's not going to happen. It's interesting when Giannis signed his extension, even though Philadelphia we never heard was in those discussions, automatically after that, okay, now we're open to trading Ben Simmons. And apparently the package that Houston wants is they want Ben Simmons, they want Thibault, their young player, and they want, I believe, 4 first-round picks, I believe. So that's a pretty big ransom. You're giving up a young star, a young, talented player, and basically your draft capital. They're basically saying you got to give us your draft capital for James Harden. So you might sit there and say, well, Philadelphia's only losing 2 players. You can see, everybody's going to sit here and say, yeah, James Harden's better than Ben Simmons. I mean, the team's not really getting that much worse. They're actually getting better. So why would Philadelphia be hesitant to make this trade? But Philadelphia is in a position where it's like, again, they have playoff aspirations. But the thing about this move, I think people don't think about this when these types of moves are asked about. If they make this move, this is the last big move, unless they trade Joel Embiid, they can make. Like, if you give up this type of capital, you literally have nothing else to trade outside of Joel Embiid. So if stuff doesn't work out, it's not like you can go acquire another big time player through trade. You gave up all your first round picks. So unless you're giving up one of your stars, you ain't really got the ability to make any more big deals. And I think that's why sometimes teams are hesitant to make deals like this. Or they're a little bit more patient before making a decision like this, because I think Daryl Morey wants to see what happens with Ben and Joel. But I also think he understands James is the reason why I am where I am. He is the reason why I've gotten the credit and the success as a GM as I've gotten. And I know how good of a player he is. And technically for what kind of team I want to have, he fits it better than Ben does. Like, Daryl has a lot of reasons to keep and to also trade for James Harden. It's just a matter of what does he feel is worth it. It's going to be interesting. Clearly Milwaukee's out because they got Giannis. So they're probably like, well, we got our guy. And, I mean, they're not willing to just trade off anything else they have. I mean, what's funny? Milwaukee still could be included in this deal. I mean, they really could be that third team for a team where it's just like, hey, Milwaukee, you got Giannis. You got to go into luxury tax. These draft picks don't mean anything to you at this point. Even if whatever draft picks they have left. I mean, remember, because they gave up a lot to get Drew Holiday. And so maybe there's a player they may want in that trade. Maybe Dante DiVincenzo. Oh, you want another young player? Okay, we'll give up Dante and maybe another guy, and we get a guy back, and it works for everybody. So these are all potential possibilities that we have to keep an eye on and just stay aware of. James Harden saga seems like it's going to be moving a little bit fast. I don't know when a trade could happen. It could happen, knowing the NBA, it could happen by next week. But it also might be another month. We might not know anything until the new year before James Harden gets traded. I wouldn't be surprised if he gets traded on the new year. That's the type of league the NBA is. So definitely got to keep an eye on that and just keep an eye on everything that's going on. But now we're going to get into some Lakers talk as the Lakers played. I want to talk about the debut of LeBron James and them. And, LeBron looked a little rusty, coming playing his first game. I think that's why this first month or half of the season is going to be challenging. Because when you win a championship like they did, you want to celebrate. Usually you got the regular offseason, you can celebrate for about a month or two, and then you can start grinding again. Like, you're going to still work out, but you're not going to work out if you were just working. You're going to still have fun. And I think that's why it's been kind of tough for LeBron, because he's done the podcast, he's done a lot of things since, everything ended. And, we have to sit here and think, LeBron's been busy. I'm sure AD, he's been having a good time. And so their biggest thing is they got to get their win back. They got to get their stuff back. And like they said, they're going to play opening day because of, the banner and everything of that. But I definitely think that the Lakers, they're definitely planning on letting LeBron and AD take games off. Because they know, at the end of the day, especially with a condensed season, we need you guys for the playoffs. And so they may sit here and say, if we're playing 4 games in a week, you're only going to play 2. If we end up having to play 5 games in a week, you're only going to play 3 or maybe 2. I'm not, or, stuff like that. I feel like they're going to limit the amount of games. So you may only see LeBron play 55 to 60 games this year. And with the depth that they have, and that's why I think it was very important for the Lakers to acquire the depth they acquired. Because now you could afford to say, hey, we can kind of sit here and allow them to take days off, take breaks, get themselves ready. Because we have a lot of guys who can come in, young guys, not older guys, a lot of younger guys who can come in, play, still make us competitive. We can still win games, still be at top seed in the Western Conference, and not feel like, dang, we need LeBron if we're going to do anything. And I think that's why I said that depth is going to be one of the most important things for a team to have this year. That's why you see teams being stacked with depth. That's where I think maybe a team like Boston might struggle because I don't feel like they still acquired that much depth this year. Because when you don't have that depth, especially in a condensed season, but it does help they have younger players, where LeBron is older. You got to make sure, hey, we're not going to burn you guys out before the big games, for the playoffs. Because if you burn out, that's going to hurt our chances. But overall, I think they did well. It seems like when LeBron was tired in that first quarter, came back in the second, really got his win back, seemed to look good. And I think he'll be ready for Tuesday opening day. Like AD, I think they'll both be ready to go and play well. So just want to talk about that real quick before we get out of here. But that's all the time we have here for the GSMC Basketball Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being let me be part of your day. Don't forget, again, to follow us on Twitter at GSMC_basketball. Also, don't forget to listen to our other living podcasts here at the GSMC Podcast Network. This is your host, Brice, saying have a good day.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Basketball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.